What's up, everybody? This is Zach, back with EM Weekly. I'm joined by Mike Johnson, which sounds like a made-up name. It sounds like a name that a Russian honeypot would give you.
Yes.
Mike, you couldn't get a more generic name.
I know. I got lucky.
You got real lucky.
Yeah.
Mike and I go way back, like decades, which is starting to...
2006, maybe 7.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, so almost 20 years. That's
7,
crazy.
I guess. Yeah, it's almost 20 years.
I have no recollection of 2003 to like 2008. Not because anything cool was happening. I just am so bad. Like that time period is like so hard to recollect. Like my wife that I met then, she's like, no, we met then. And I was like, that's not possible. I would have been like this old, but I think my brain just might be going.
It might be the repeated traumatic brain injuries, but the past is one big day. You know what I mean? Like things didn't happen 10 years ago. They happened in the morning from my perspective.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It's just
all right. We're already getting into some philosophical stuff. I love it.
One big day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty long time. I mean, and then there's like weird stuff. For the longest time I was carrying around your diploma. I had that for about 10 years.
I left, we had an apartment together and I left that apartment in a hurry. I think I left
everything. Like something terrible had happened, but it kind of did actually. And that's why we're going to talk about today is you joined the Army.
Yeah, I know. That was terrible. Well,
real quick, we're going to take an ad break. Are you ready to enhance your emergency response skills? Join us in L3 Harris on July 23rd at the Hilton Vancouver, Washington for Stressing Communications, a specialized training and exercise event designed for first responders. This year's scenario is mass casualty incident at a parade featuring today's most advanced critical communications technologies. Hear from keynote speakers like Pete Gaynor, Jake Shores, Anthony Escato, and Barry Moss, leaders in emergency management and communications. Don't miss this opportunity to learn from the best, network with peers, and prepare for the unexpected. Register today.
In hindsight, speaking of going back 20 years, you missed the branch of choice was right there in front of you.
I know. I would love to go back because what I was doing, I'm sure you remember this. I had graduated college and I knew
that because I had your diploma.
You had my diploma. I didn't have it. I didn't know. I was pretty sure I'd graduated. And I was waiting to join the Army. So I was hanging out in that apartment. I was working out twice a day and playing Call of Duty in between.
Training.
And that was all I was doing.
All training. That was all part of him getting ready for Army school.
That's right. I had nothing else to do. So I was like, you know what?
It was like I had like a stepchild from hell living in the apartment.
Was it that bad?
I was like, you're just playing video. I'm like, I get home from work. I'm like, what did you do all day? You're like, I worked out and played video games.
I'm like,
yeah. This is unbelievable. I've been working all day. I have expectations that the house would be clean. It was all good. That was
I was sleeping on an air mattress too.
We did. Yep. We both had, it was, I think I had this has been brought up. I think we had a bowl. We each had a bowl, a spoon, and then the biggest TV I could find on from like Craigslist or whatever the equivalent would have been back then. And then a couch we found next to a dumpster. It's like classic college disgusting dude stuff. And it was actually a lot of fun.
It was a ton of fun. But looking back at my life, I think the moment where I felt most like an adult was when I didn't have any furniture in my house that I'd found on the side of the road. That was amazing.
I
looked around and be like, man, I actually bought all this stuff.
Yeah, they never thought I would do it.
They didn't think I could do it. Look at us now.
Yeah, that's great. Humble brag. You know, what a flex on the start of the podcast. This guy buys his own furniture.
Buy my own. I don't no longer get furniture on the side of the road.
My own furniture. I think I still get stuff from the side of the road. We put stuff out by the side of the road recently, though, so that was good. We're returning the favor at least.
You need to give back to the community. Yeah. To be fair, though, I only own 3 pieces of furniture. So it's not
all right. So
a couch, a TV, and an air mattress. And I bought all of them.
Wow. On a payment plan, though. I hope you didn't spend all your money at once.
It's rent to own. Okay. It's rent to own.
All right, perfect.
And you're losing money if you don't do it.
Yeah.
You know?
So for people who've never listened to this before, even actually people who have listened to this is probably like the most jarring version of this podcast since I've had it. It's a lot easier to talk to someone you've known them a very long time, and I don't have anything to prove to Mike. He's seen me at my darkest and my brightest.
Best and worst. Yeah, I know the full spectrum of Zack. And it's great, and I love it. That's why I'm here.
Yeah, he's Mike is hopefully going to be a permanent fixture on the podcast shortly. So breaking news. So we ran a podcast before. We've done we did video game stuff together. We did all sorts of cool stuff, and now it's like coming full circle. So you got into the Army somehow. I mean, it was amazing.
It was a different time. It was the height of the global war on terror. They would take anybody,
literally anyone. And Mike showed up at the apartment one day, and then he packed up his air mattress, and I never saw him again.
And I was like, I'm going to the South. I don't need this jacket anymore.
Yeah. It's like, I'm going to do Army man stuff. And I was like, okay, I guess that's cool.
Dude.
And so when you left to go do the Army stuff, you managed to get into probably one of the hardest and maybe I wouldn't say worst, but like probably sketchiest jobs in the Army and potentially in the military, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, aka EOD.
I did. And it was sort of a circuitous path. I came in with an infantry contract. I was sitting at airborne hold, waiting to go to airborne school. And the Special Forces recruiters came and said, who wants to go to Special Forces selection? And I was young and stupid and said, I'll do it. Heck. Yeah. So I went to Fort Bragg. I got there and they looked at my medical records, realized I wasn't actually medically qualified to do it. I have eyesight issues. So I never went to selection. And as I was sitting there in hold, waiting to go to an airborne unit, they were just putting me on details. I remember I would volunteer for this detail where I'd go out in the woods and we were cutting down trees and running through a wood chipper for a week at a time.
Use your tax dollars at work, folks.
It was a lot of fun.
It probably was a lot of fun.
It was so much fun.
That's like when you like rolling rocks down hills, all that stuff where you're just like arbitrary destruction of things is very fun.
And I think honestly, the thing, just to take it to 30,000 foot level, the thing I really enjoy about any work in the military in particular is you're just hanging out with a small group of guys or gals doing weird things.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
that sums up like most of my military career. Yeah.
And that's what that was. So eventually I got sick of it. And the only way to get out of the detail was to volunteer to go see the EOD recruiter. So I volunteered to go see the EOD recruiter. I heard their pitch and it sounded fantastic. It was a small group of guys doing weird technical things.
The pitch was just like he just like put a video up on the wall and it was just like, you were like, I'm so in.
I'll do that. So boom, you got it. So I volunteered for that. Went to the school down there at Eglin Air Force Base. And about a year later, graduated as an EOD tech.
And then the rest was history.
And the rest was history. That's right.
Yeah, you got to do a lot of cool stuff. And I guess, what does a EOD tech do? I think it's one of those jobs that I think people have sort of a generic understanding of they disable bombs and they kind of maybe blow up, UXOs and stuff. But it's a pretty complex, the school's pretty long. Yeah. It's really technical. You have to learn a lot of different things.
So I'll give you basically a short history of EOD in the U.S. military. So it started in World War II when Nazi Germany and the Japanese started dropping aerial bombs on cities. And obviously prior to that, there was explosive ordnance in World War I, but it was all landing on a battlefield, so nobody cared if it blew up or not. So it lands in a city with civilians, and you have to figure out some way to disable it safely. So that spawned the EOD career field, people that can render safe explosive hazards, unexploded ordnance. So in the Cold War, past World War II, the big threat was a nuclear attack. So that expanded EOD's responsibility to include CBRN threats, so chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats. And at least in the Army, what they did was they spread EOD teams out throughout the country in small detachments to kind of assist in case there's a dud-fired nuclear weapon or a nuclear accident involving U.S. ordnance nuclear ordnance somewhere in the United States. So they're spread out all over the place. And then I think it was the Carter administration, there was an IED that went off somewhere near President Carter, killed an EOD tech. And that gave the EOD community sort of a homeland defense mission. That was the impetus to make, right into law, military EOD's responsibility for unexploded ordnance and IEDs within the United States to respond to them. So that it basically expanded their charter slightly. And then we had the global war on terror happened. IEDs obviously were a huge part of the threat to risk to forces overseas, and that expanded their realm of responsibility a little bit more to focus on tactical IED render safe. And now we find ourselves post global war on terror, and the future of EOD in like a near peer competition, great power competition is a little bit murkier, and people are trying to figure out exactly what their role is going to be. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes in the future. But it does, so it's expand the whole realm of responsibility is explosive and seaborne threats inside the United States. So coordinating with local law enforcement and federal law enforcement to deal with those things. And then the kind of tactical response to explosive and seaborne threats overseas in war zones.
Yeah, and typically, like, you're embedded with, it's really all the branches potentially, right? Because there's not that many EOD techs across the whole enterprise of the Department of Defense. So
yeah, it's a fundamentally a support MOS, right? Like the Army has its main focus is to deploy infantry. So everyone is supporting the infantry, including EOD. So you're always a support guy. The Air Force, it would be airplanes, I guess. So generally, my understanding of the Air Force EOD is they focus on flight lines.
I think it's like tanning and looking cool is my...
Yeah, and they do it well. And they do it well. And obviously the Navy is, they focus on mine warfare, counter mine warfare to protect the force. And then they have their special operations guys as well. And the Marine Corps is like the Army. They have infantry, so you're supporting infantry.
Yeah,
so
I would
EOD,
say probably...
Always a support guy. Always a support guy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, especially because, again, with a limited amount of you and the fact that the job itself is inherently dangerous, you probably don't really want them super close in the fight. You need them to sort of be available when that situation comes up where you're like, oh, they found something. And I think, like, correct me if I'm wrong, most infantry are given some degree of an awareness level in how to basically find, the telltales of a IED or UXO or something. Anyway, so there's some of that. So you're really to go in and sort of remove the threat through various means.
That's right. Yeah.
Some of them sound really cool.
There's there's a doctrinal dispute. Like, you're right. There aren't very many of us. So the normal way it was done in the global war on terror was like called a firehouse model. So you'd have EOD guys on a fob somewhere, and then infantry would go out. They would use those skills they've learned in training to identify that there's a wire sticking out of the ground, or there's a ground sign there. Let's call EOD, and then EOD would drive out, take care of the ID, and then come back. And then there was a more niche application of that where you had EOD guys directly assigned to special operation teams that would travel with that special operation team directly and work with them one-on-one and go on patrol with them. So that was the other model. And then in competition with that, too, are the combat engineers who are doctrinally trained to kind of do the same thing.
It's like sappers, right? Is that the same sort of,
Yep. And they have usually they're dealing with obstacles, and they work at a larger level. So EOD, the most important echelon in an EOD formation is the team, which is only 3 people. So by comparison, explosive engineers, or combat engineers rather, are working at like a company, battalion levels. So they have a different capability. They can provide a like maybe less niche, but no less important.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And then domestically, you guys, like you said, you were used in a bunch of different ways, including, kind of the 911 call, local cop, finds a hand grenade in someone's basement or something. And then potentially in like a, national security event type of thing, like, large events, Super Bowls, RNC, DNC things, anywhere where probably the president's traveling and stuff, I would imagine.
Yeah. So after that IED went off near, I believe it was Carter, it's by law, military EOD has to be part of the Secret Service kind of search of anything involving presidents, heads of state, that kind of stuff. So
is that the JHAT model? Is that JHAT or something? Is that what it's called? I know there's
doesn't ring a bell.
Okay. Yeah. I think like CBRN, like the CSTs have some sort of like limited thing that they plug into Ulster, but I'm probably just talking incorrectly. So
I haven't heard that phrase.
Okay. Well, then it's probably just straight made up. But yeah,
I'm not an
that's
expert.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, you actually are. You just described back to the Carter administration, and
legal
prior.
history.
So, and then so once you stopped, I guess like maybe even give us a little bit of like day in the life of what that kind of looked like and your deployed status, and then maybe back home when you're in garrison.
Well, as you can imagine, that's a wide charter. So like your average EOD team needs to be able to respond to like the World War II hand grenade found in Grandpa's attic, all the way up to like a dud-fired nuclear missile, right? And then also responding to tactical IEDs overseas. So, and then respond to these Secret Service missions that come up pretty frequently. So it's a wide range of things you have to train and be good at. And you don't have a whole lot of time in garrison to do it. So being good and agile at designing training, understanding what your mission is and what benefit you can provide to the various customers that you might have, that's probably wider than the average set of customers, I think, in the military, is a skill that needs to be practiced. And so the company I ended up where I did most of my operational work was at Fort Bragg. And we were supporting overseas missions outside of the global war on terror. So in North Africa, Northwest Africa, and Central Asia. And there were primarily training missions with a little bit of like risk to force mitigation stuff, but primarily just training partner forces.
Yeah.
So that's what we focused on, was getting good at training partner forces, and then also training on these what are called homeland defense missions of like responding to, the grenade in Grandpa's attic, and that can run the wide gamut. So, for instance, I got a call from the Raleigh, or from a local airport. I don't remember which airport it was. That some Marine had taken a penetrator from an Abrams, so the Sabo penetrators,
nice.
through security.
They caught it, so that's good.
Yeah, they found it. And the problem with those is they can contain depleted uranium, which is a radiological hazard. So I did some Google. I wasn't sure they'd ever use them. The EPA website claimed that they had been used. So I had to go out there. I had to be familiar with how to use my radiological equipment and what safe levels were. And then if it was depleted uranium, how to package and handle the radiological hazard. So that's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end is, it was rural North Carolina. So you had farmers with dynamite from like the 1920s.
Just sweating glycerin.
Just sweating glycerin, right? Sitting in people's barns. And then they would find that and call the local police, who would then call us. And then, of course, there's always kind of the crazy person that calls in a suspect package as a possible IED. And had to respond to that as well. So it was a wide range of possible of threats that you had to be familiar with.
I think, so my listeners are primarily emergency management, but we have a lot of military and first responders and stuff. But I think everyone's probably had those random calls. I was a higher ed emergency manager. I remember we had to call in a whole bunch of different agencies and bomb threats because this retired professor had passed away, and they found all sorts of weird chemical vials with mixtures, and some stuff was had basically like, off-gassed into these like crystals that were highly volatile that like if you bumped it, it could explode. And then it's next to this huge jar of like mercury that they somehow kept and all this other stuff. So any community can have it. And I also think it's, there is some really good training you can take through through FEMA and DHS, where you can kind of go and recognize the precursors and see what that stuff looks like out in the field. And they even blow stuff up for you, which is kind of cool. But
that's very cool.
I mean, you got to blow stuff up too. So like what were the kind of things that you got to do with that? Cause I think like your task in specific, so like a lot of probably combat is like, there's not a ton of innovation in like infantry movements, right, and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
But there was a lot of innovation in the weapons and stuff that were used by us and against us throughout the global war on terrorism, including like, the IEDs were becoming much more sophisticated,
right?
Like shape charges that could punch through, the stuff that we had, and reusing weapons. And now you've got, UAVs and UAS is probably like the biggest sort of concern right now.
Yeah.
So how do you, because you were also responsible for training EOD technicians and stuff,
right,
and you ran teams and stuff yourself.
Right.
How do you actually create that training environment where you're not stuck kind of just doing remedial, maybe doctrinal stuff, but like really trying to stay ahead of the curve? Because if you don't, you don't want to get surprises. I imagine you don't want to be surprised as an EOD tech when you walk up to something.
Yeah. What it comes down to is understanding what operational environment you're going into, because the threat is so incredibly varied.
Yeah.
Globally. Right. So one of the pitfalls I saw in training is that people would put up what we would call, and this was my experience in my first unit when I deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, they would set up what were generally called like screw you problems, but maybe not so politically correct. So I remember they would set up these training problems. Everything would be booby trapped. There'd be IEDs in every doorway, every window, and you were required to render safe every single thing that was in that room. So then
just to slow them down, if nothing else, right? Like it's a harassment thing now at this point, right?
Right. It's harassment, right? And then the problem with that is you get to your deployed environment, Iraq or Afghanistan. I remember, for instance, we would be in these mount sites, these urban training sites that are basically just Connex containers welded together. And if there's a carpet inside of the Connex container, there's an IED underneath of it, because that's the only place they can hide it inside it, which is great until you go into a house in Iraq and there's carpets everywhere. And then if you have no other experience, you're going to freak out. So realism, researching the environment you're going into, understanding a realistic threat and training to that realistic threat is crucial. If you overtrain your guys to think that everything is dangerous, you're going to, as an enabler, grind to a halt the mission of the force or the unit that you're trying to support.
Right.
And you're not going to make yourself a benefit. You're there in a deployed environment. You're basically there to facilitate mobility for whatever combat arms unit you're providing. And if you turn an IED, you change the mission from we're going in this house to get this guy to I need to search every single nook and cranny to find IEDs. Like, you've changed the mission for them. You're no longer a benefit. So having a realistic understanding of what the threat you're going to face and training to that specific threat is important.
So you're doing like a risk assessment constantly on this thing.
Constantly.
Like, and it's got to change. I mean, you can't really afford to be overly risk averse because like you said, you're going to just basically grind everything to a halt. But
correct,
you also want to make sure that everyone is at least, diligent enough that they're going to pick up on like things that are truly out of the ordinary.
Right. Exactly right. And respond appropriately to, like actual indicators rather than just making up indicators on your own as you go. So the realism is very important. And then the trick, though, is, like you said, not to train to mundane standards where you aren't expecting the out of the ordinary thing. You also train for the low probability, high risk event.
Sure. Yeah.
And that is tricky to inject into a training environment. I think it's important to put it in there just to, one of the downfalls is obviously the trainer that's setting up the training knows the TTPs that the trainees are going to use. And to set up training where that TTP just simply fails.
That's tactics, techniques, and
procedures, right? So to kind of get inside the trainees like OODA loop, I suppose, and then subvert it.
observe, orient, decide, act.
Right. To kind of get in there and then subvert it in a way that shows that TTP will fail is not good, because it teaches the trainee that what you're teaching them doesn't work. So it's sort of a balancing act of finding things just slightly outside, slightly not covered by your tactics, techniques, and procedures, but they don't completely undermine them and destroy the trainees' trust in what you're teaching them.
So you would let them fail, right? I mean, like that's got to be a part of it, right? Yeah. So I think that is something that I see probably more so on the military side. Not always. Like a lot of our exercise that we run in the military, there is a lot of it is just to check the box, like an annual certification of some technique that we got to do or whatever. But in some cases, we're more apt. So we had a big exercise not that long ago, and I usually kind of skate through those. I work in an office essentially. So and we're with the commanders, and typically we're sort of not near the front line, so we don't get to play real very often. And we all got killed during the exercise because I didn't wait for the all clear and went out in the middle of a par check, and they're like, boom, you're dead. And I was like, oh, that was totally stupid. I knew not to do it. And I was trying to be proactive in our response because the command post got blown up. So I was like, oh, we got to get to the alternate so we can make sure we get the information out and save more lives. And because I was not thinking, through that cycle, I was thinking, here's the objective I'm trying to accomplish, and didn't do any of the stuff in between that. I took my whole team out, we got blown up. And so that's something we don't necessarily do on the civilian side. I think a lot of times we already know what we're trying to accomplish, and we don't let people fail. And what that leads to is, like, when it really happens, people are like shocked when things don't go well. Right. And they don't have that ability to sort of think on their feet. So emergency management, very doctrinal. There's steps, there's procedures. It's very structured. And when that fails, whether it's ICS or whether it's the procedure you're working on, or it's just the situation is not something you ever thought about. You got to be able to think on your feet. And that's really challenging to sort of recreate while you're still trying to check those boxes, because you do have to certify people. You do have to get them, trained on that stuff. But at the same time, like, give an opportunity to, this is new and you may not do it right the first time, and that's okay.
Yeah. And it's a problem too, because I assume on the civilian side is not something you're training on constantly. So in the military, if you have a given job, you're training on it not every day, but pretty close to every day, weekly for sure.
Sure.
So you have this opportunity to build, let's get good at the mundane steps. We'll get these guys good at just managing normal situations. And once they're trained on that, then we can take them to the next level of being able to kind of think on their feet a little bit. And imagine that would be a challenge in the civilian sector, because you're not necessarily training on emergency management stuff year round.
Yeah, I mean, the resources are a lot different. One thing that I think is pretty awesome about the military is there is essentially a job for everything. Like, there's someone doing every specialty you can imagine in the military. And obviously you wear a lot of hats, but the guys who drive the buses, the girls who fly the planes, they all have a very specific role, and then it all kind of comes together. Yeah. And we also work together a lot more often than, if you're going out on a training, the Air Force is going to probably fly you there. Right. You might land at a naval base, and, that's where you're kind of setting up. You might, work with your Marine counterparts. So there's a lot of sort of interagents, branch work, and, different domains all kind of coming together. We don't necessarily do that as well on the civilian side, because the resources are a little bit smaller, and when we're not at war, the military trains, right? And that's just built into it. And the civilian side, you're kind of always at war, if you will. And I think obviously it is what it is. I don't expect there to be a huge increase in funding for that, but you see the results a lot more often that, we don't, even when we're doing really good work, there's still so many, you look at after actions and you're like, why are we making these same mistakes over and over and over? And, we just don't have time to learn from those either. I mean, the whole after action process and the civilian side can take years.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of built into every single action that you take in the military. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I can understand it is sort of a niche. Like I would assume, given its name, emergency management involves like the low probability, high risk events, which people don't tend to prepare for. But in my experience, those are the most lethal events that happen.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. It's the one that's going to cause the most harm, be the most challenging to recover from. And ultimately probably kill the most people, and harm your community the most. But it is a different mindset too. I mean, trying sometimes to talk leadership, like political leadership, into saying like, hey, can we simulate like a large IED going off downtown during like a, farmer's market where it'll kill like 50 people. And they're like, no, I don't want the news finding out about this, or like, and then their fear is like, well, it'll give someone the idea to do it. And you're like, well, people are already having these ideas. That's why we have to train for it.
Right.
This is not an idea I came up with. It's because they do this overseas constantly.
On a regular basis.
We need to learn from that so that we're better prepared. But it's a different appetite for sure. But
and I mean, it's understandable too. Like if you shut down that farmer's market, those guys aren't making money, so.
Yeah. I mean, it's a balance, but so training and exercising is obviously a huge component of that. What are like the sort of progressive like steps in your career? Like you obviously start out sort of as a trainee, I'm guessing, on a team and kind of learn the ropes, and then you move into like a leadership position. And then how did you sort of progress through your career to where you are today?
Yeah. So the normal path in all the services in this career field is you graduate from the school, which certifies you. Let me step back. I actually misstated something earlier. So I said our military EOD is responsible for IEDs in the United States. That's not true. There's something called the Hazardous Device School that will certify local bomb squads and federal bomb squads to deal with IEDs.
Sure.
The only thing they're not certified to deal with is unexploded ordnance. So there are local bomb squads at most large towns that can deal with IEDs.
They'll handle like the typical like suspicious package type stuff.
Correct, for the most part. And they're not everywhere, and they don't have all the resources, so sometimes they get called out. But so the basic progression is you graduate from the school, you serve some time as a team member on that one of those 3-person teams, learning the ropes, learning how to use the tools, and then you go through something. And this is for all services, but the requirements are service specific. You get your team leader certification, which certifies you to do render safe procedures without supervision for the most part. So once you get that certification, you're now a team leader and can deploy overseas in support of whoever, or respond on your own to local homeland defense missions, which is kind of where, and I try to stay at that level for as long as possible. I was a team leader as a sergeant, a young sergeant, and I stayed at E5 for those in the military, and I refused to get promoted. I just didn't go. I refused to go to the board because I wanted to be. You can't. They can't. Well, they can eventually.
Eventually, yes.
Eventually, they literally made me for as long as possible because I wanted to stay in. I was an E5 for a very long time.
Sure.
And eventually, promoted me to staff sergeant to E6.
Scumbags
forced me to go to the board. I know. And that's basically the progression. So you get your team leader certification. And then you spend some time at that level. I try to stay as long as possible. And then you promote out of that into like a platoon sergeant or a managerial role where you're running a team of a series of EOD teams, like usually 3 EOD teams in an Army platoon.
Yeah.
And you're responsible for their training. And
it just kind of, continues from there until you get into roles where you start to manage larger and larger groups and
that's right.
Do less and less of the job, which is,
start writing doctrine and buying equipment and that kind of stuff. So,
and then you were at the training school for quite a while as well, right?
Yeah. And then I went to the EOD school down there at Eglin Air Force Base as an instructor for, I think, 3 years in the Ground Ordnance Division, which was a lot of fun, super fun.
Because it's on an Air Force base, so it's got all the nice facilities and everything.
It's in very nice facilities.
And in Florida, on like the beach, Florida. Basically, right? Yeah.
It's a pretty good lifestyle. It's where, it's probably true of any organization, but the schoolhouse is where people go to take breaks. Yeah. Because you don't deploy, you have a pretty easy schedule. So I went there to, take a break. Yeah.
And your deployment, I mean, you were gone quite a bit.
Not as much as some. I remember I was on one deployment and I was talking to the warrant officer on the team, and he was like, Mike, I don't remember if this is my 15th or 16th deployment. And I was like, God, night.
Yeah.
Dang.
That's a lot. Yeah. But you got like redeployed and stuff while you were out there, and like, I mean, it still is like a fairly demanding role. And again, like just being limited in resources, you only have so many EOD techs at any time. Like it is like,
you're going to be busy. Yeah. Well, I think I was TDY 6 months out, I was traveling for work probably 6 months out of the year until I became an instructor. So, I mean, you're busy with all the Secret Service missions and the Homeland Defense and deployments. And that's just being gone. So then when you're back, you're training in the field and so on. So, you're going to be busy.
And now you are retired out of the active duty.
Well, separated from active duty, moved into the reserves. Yep.
Yeah. You're on that sweet 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, which is not realistic. It's going to probably end up being a lot busier than you anticipate.
Oh, you think so? That's fine.
Well, you have I guess you have like a pretty good, like stable job. At least on the guard side, we are plugging every hole that the federal government can find. So basically, since COVID, we have done a little bit of everything. I mean, I'm a command and control operations. Actually, we changed. I think now it's all domain command and control operations specialist. And I was on a COVID vaccination team as like, the assistant NCO of the team.
Oh, yeah.
And then we were in hospitals, like basically just supporting all the medical staff because they had so many people that were sick and stuff.
Yeah.
I think at one point they were running like buses in some jurisdictions because they didn't have enough bus drivers. Yeah. During the whole January 6th and all the civil unrest ahead of time, there was tons of activations for that to do, anything from sort of crowd, control to additional security. I mean, people were posted at the Capitol for months after January 6th.
Sleeping in parking garages. Yeah.
Yep. There was, it is pretty challenging to sort of do all that stuff. But I mean, I think a lot of people don't even with the EOD role, they don't think about the fact that it's not just, the kind of war fighting that I think a lot of people think of. It's the military is pretty well ingrained in a lot of our local stuff. And
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. But it sounds like your new gig should be pretty chill. So
I haven't checked in yet, so we'll see. But hopefully, I have 30 days.
Did you check the paperwork? Are you supposed to be at the base right now? Huh? This is going to be problematic.
I may be AWOL. No, I have 30 days, so I got a couple weeks left. But
yeah. And then basically now you kind of get to decide what you want to do on the civilian side. So
yes. Yeah, transition has been interesting. I'm in a pretty good spot. My wife is still in the Air Force, so we don't lose any of those Air Force or the military benefits.
Yeah,
still have health insurance, still have her paycheck coming in, still have childcare, all that kind of stuff. So really, I'm in probably the most ideal situation you can be in when you transition out of the military.
Are you just working out and playing video games all day?
If stalking on LinkedIn, maybe that's the grown-up version.
It kind of is.
That's the grown-up version of video games.
I mean, we do have a lot of, so the military transition thing I think it's a lot more challenging than a lot of people think it's going to be when they get out. There's a degree of, when you get recruited into anything, the first thing the recruiter says is like, oh, it doesn't matter what the job is. Oh, you're going to have so many jobs when you get out of the military. Like you're going to be fighting people off. But the truth is it's pretty challenging and you have to adapt. You're kind of like even more in transition because you are still sort of like in the military community and stuff. So it's not like you fully stepped off. But for a lot of people, everything that is different. Just in our conversation, you use 50 acronyms, right?
Right.
And going into the civilian world, half of those mean nothing to civilians. Your job, even as an EOD, right? Like unless you're going into EOD position, the actual EOD stuff, isn't that super useful in a daily thing? So you have to figure out, what did I do and how do I translate that? So I'm assuming you're working through that right now.
Right. So at a 30,000 foot view, like I've never made anybody money, right? Which is in the civilian world, what you're saying you can do, right? Yeah. I can either save you money or I can make you money.
Yes.
And you're right. So all the hard skills that you've probably, anyone in the military has gathered up over time are probably not very translatable.
Yeah.
Depending. So what you end up with are basically just soft skills.
Yeah.
And then proof maybe that you can like put up with punishment, that you are resilient.
Yeah.
And will work hard. Right.
Yeah.
And that's about all you got. So trying to figure out how to translate, I think focusing on those soft skills and then actually researching an industry, understanding the challenges of the industry that matches your interests.
Sure.
And then finding a way to translate those soft skills and say, here are some challenges you probably are facing in industry, and here are some ways that I can help solve those challenges given these soft skills and willingness to learn. I think it's probably your best starting point. And then no, go ahead. You would have more insights.
I was going to say, military, one of the advantages of being in the military is like you have to be highly adaptable because like I just said, like you never really, even in your career field, you never really know what you're going to do on a day-to-day basis. And you're used to hurry up and wait. You're used to, here's what we asked you to do. Here's what we're actually doing. And here's the equipment we told you were going to have. And here's the equipment you actually have.
Right. Yeah.
And, so, being adaptable is pretty easy, but that translation I think is really tough for folks. And like, it's an identity too, right? Like, I don't think we talk about enough the sort of your loss of identity. I think that leads to a lot of like the depression and the suicides and all the stuff that comes after the military that like is not great, is because, you're in, like you said, one of the cool parts about being in the military is you have this like little community of people that like you have gone through hell with, and you have to, rely on each other implicitly to accomplish a mission. And it's totally different on the civilian world. Every time, and again, I'm talking from a reserve component, aspect, but like, I'll spend like a few weeks doing some sort of big exercise or something. And then I come back and I'm like, why don't people just listen to me? Like, let's just do things. Like, I don't want to talk about it. Like, this is what has to get done.
Yeah.
Like, do it. And that's it. And it's like, well, that's not how the real world works. Like it is totally different. There's a lot of different, and people don't want to be yelled at and told what to do if they don't listen.
Right.
And that's not implying that I'm yelling at my coworkers at, Doberman
Often.
or the readiness lab, but, it is a different adjustment and a different sort of mindset that, I think a lot of people can struggle with because, even like thinking about your rank and, all the stuff that you've achieved, it's, if you're you're an E6, E7? Probably E7. Yeah. So E7 in the military is a pretty big deal. Like you're in the senior NCO Corps and you have a lot of sway and you can tell people what to do and they will listen. It doesn't mean jack in the civilian world. Like nobody knows what that is. Yeah. Nobody really cares. They might be impressed because you're in the military, but beyond just sort of the, superficial, unless they are, former military or had family in it, it means nothing to them.
Right.
And that adjustment can be really tough for people because you're like, oh, I was here and now I'm sort of like back on an even keel with everyone else.
Yeah. And that, you're starting over in an industry, especially coming out, like if I'm almost 40 years old and like I'm looking at going into basically entry level positions in new industries. So that can be, swallow your pride a little bit. You're starting over. But I think that's one of the benefits. It's all about how you frame it. So through my whole career, like I've always been like a support. I've been the new guy every time, especially in EOD. You're always getting farmed out to different units. You're constantly the new guy. And I think the trick is to just find the way, how you can be a benefit to them, right? And kind of put your ego to the side. And maybe that's just a leadership lesson in general that I've had to learn over the years is like, I And well, how do I put this? I mean, to some degree, we're all the cogs in a machine, right? So you need to kind of determine, everyone has a boss. So you determine what benefit you can bring to an organization. You articulate that benefit. And if they're a good manager or a good leader, they're not going to say no to a benefit to their organization, right? So if you can kind of reframe it in that way, give up on that past identity and just figure out how you can help, right? And articulate that.
I mean, get the coin rack and your, ribbon case and everything up on the wall, be proud of what you've done and everything.
Sure.
But, be okay with the fact that like, that's a part of your past and it's not necessarily who you will be in the future. And I think, that's, it is. And I mean, I get it. Like I, stayed on the, our state USAR team because that was where all my firefighter buddies were. I was not useful to them at all. I couldn't make any of the deployment, like, cause anytime they were deploying, the air guards like, whoa, you need to actually stay with us cause we might need you. Yeah. And so I was like going to trainings, not as much as I should have and stuff, but I like didn't want to quit, even though I knew I was not super valuable to the team because I was like, oh, that's where all my firefighter buddies are. And I don't want to lose that part of my life.
Right.
And then Mike Cannon, who was the team leader, is like, finally, like, he's like, dude, what are you doing? He's like, it's okay to quit. Like, we're not going to not be friends with you or like shun you if you leave. Like you can still be friends with us. You can still hang out with us. We will see each other at the same conferences and stuff. Mm-hmm. He's like, but now you don't have to worry about it.
Right.
And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And then I like stepped out of it and I was like, oh, all right, cool. Like, and sure enough, like I can still talk to all those guys and still hang out with them if I want to and stuff.
Exactly.
But it's probably more jarring in the military because like literally like suddenly you're not on the base, suddenly you're not in your shop. And there is that like invisible wall between the civilian world and the military world. Like even if you're in a military community, you can see the physical wall and that's what separates it. And so it is a much more jarring, I think, transition. But I think the advice you just gave is really important, not just for the military transition, but anyone who's like coming out of like a long career in something and trying something different. Mm-hmm. Plus the unknowns, right? Like unknowns are scary. People don't want to do that.
Yeah. Well, to quote the great American poet, Andre 3000, you're only as funky as your last cut.
Yeah.
So the past is important, but like, you gotta focus on the future, what benefits you can bring to other people. So I don't know. That's the way I think about it. And I think it's been helpful.
There you go. I think we'll end on that. So Mike is available for philosophical discussions and speeches. He is on LinkedIn, playing LinkedIn, like he said, between his workouts.
Correct. So,
and then he's going to be on the podcast, hopefully as the regular co-host.
That'd be great. Awesome. If you'll have me, that'd be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. I was supposed to have a co-host, and I think I had him for a day before something came up, and then he couldn't do it anymore. And then I've been freewheeling it since.
I'll try and get at least 2 days in.
That's great.
To double.
That would actually be very impressive. That's a 200% increase in productivity.
That's what I'm saying. You know what I mean? It's all about spin.
See, what an optimist. Hear this? You guys want to hire this guy. All right, man. Well, then in that case, we will talk next week, probably about more cool stuff. We'll mix up some military emergency management, some I think what we really want to sort of move towards is like starting to talk more about like technologies, like implementing stuff, like innovative sort of thinking. Okay. So talking about like the training, the exercise, like how do we improve that in public safety, using your knowledge of the military, talk through some scenarios and stuff. I think having you as sort of like, and Mike is sort of looking at emergency management as a future career. So
true. Yep.
It'll be good to sort of drag him through this as well as he's getting spun up and trained on that. But also just sort of like looking at incidents and sort of saying like, well, here's, the different perspectives on this and how would you think through this? Cause I've been sort of poisoned by decades of working in public safety. And so you don't have the, the bad habits and stuff in your head that I do. So we could have some fresh eyes on stuff.
It'd be fun. I'd love to learn. That'd be great.
Awesome. All right. Well, then, Mike, see you next week. Right. And everyone else, like, subscribe. You smash that like button. Leave comments. Tell Mike how awesome he is. And then he'll come back. So for 3, maybe even 4.
3. Yeah.
Maybe not 4. Let's not go crazy.
Let's not push our luck here.
All right. Well, we'll chat later, Mike.